Thanks so much, everybody, for coming and joining us. Happy Climate Week, particularly to those of you in New York. There's a lot of exciting things going on this week. My name is Nick Astor. I'm the Director of Marketing for South Pole. I'd like to welcome you to our panel conversation today called The Scaling of the Next Generation of Carbon Removals. For those of you who don't know South Pole, we're a global climate solutions company. We develop and implement emission reduction projects and strategies that turn climate action into long-term business opportunities. I'm really excited today to introduce 4 distinguished speakers. First, we're going to hear from Misha Repman. He is the Senior Environmental Management Specialist at SwissRe. Misha is going to lay out some of the reasons why carbon removal technology is increasingly important. Following Misha, we're going to hear from Ryo Okamura, who works in the upstream carbon management at Mitsubishi, as well as Patrick Berge, who's the innovation director here at South Pole. And they're going to discuss our new carbon removal purchase facility. And finally, Michael Avery is here from 1.5, and he will be showcasing one of our flagship projects coming out of that facility. There will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the conversation. If you do have questions, feel free to ask them via the chat function, which you should see in your control panel on the right side of your screen. We will be collecting those questions and putting them together to ask everybody to ask the panels at the end of the presentations. Without further ado, we'll aim for an hour. If we're having a really good time, we could go a little bit over, but otherwise I will disappear and turn the camera over to Misha and get things moving. Thanks so much.
All right, very happy to kick this panel off, giving a bit of a background why we talk removals during the New York Climate Week and how that leads to the proposition that you're going to hear from Patrick. And the best to tell you the why is to take you through the intro slides that I usually use to take people through SwissRe's net zero journey. So bear with me, it's a bit of an educational piece. It's not so much concrete what SwissRe is doing despite the title. I hope this works for everyone. Okay. So essentially, that is the key slide on the why. This shows the global emissions as they develop over time. And it shows a purple line that is the net emissions path that can keep us on a global warming path of 1.5 degrees. And it shows us that, and that's essentially an IPCC projection. So that's what climate science tells us. It's the P4 scenario, which assumes that we had done little since that IPCC report appeared in 2018. And that's exactly the reality that we're facing. So it says us we have to do 3 things. The first is to massively reduce emissions. But even if we manage to reduce wherever and as fast as possible we can, there will be remaining emissions that cannot be reduced yet. And that stays like that throughout the century. So the red area is our still positive emissions, and that is never zero all the way to the year 2100. So then the second is we need to be at net zero around mid-century, and the third is we need to be net negative throughout the second half of the century. And now you compare the area. The blue is the negative emissions we have to actively produce or provide, and the red is the emissions that we already put into the air. You see how this is, becoming a comparable integral. So it's a really massive task if you look a bit ahead, not only the next decade, but if we look ahead, we see something will have to happen, and we need to be ready for that. And the reason why negative emissions are key, and why we argue usually that we should have separate targets, one for reductions, one for removals, is we need to balance the hard to reduce emissions. And we know there are industries that are harder to abate, or their emissions are harder to reduce than others. But it's also clear that we can then, backtrack these emissions and account for them. So that's kind of the easy task. We also have to balance Earth's own emissions from forest fires or thawing permafrost or things like that. Much harder to allocate to individual players or countries or people responsible or companies responsible. And the third is to reverse the buildup of historic emissions that we are currently producing. This is the undoing the bad, basically, or undoing the overshoot emissions that we currently put into the atmosphere. So for all these reasons and all these amount here in blue, that's why negative emissions are needed. Now, if you're a company, many have committed to net zero by now, with some current emission level and a net zero target. What you have to do now is first reduce. You should set yourself a science-based target with interim targets to really bring down those emissions in the first place. The second is then to ramp up removals. You have to balance in your target year any residual remaining emissions with the same amount of negative emissions. And you cannot wait until a year before the target year to start contemplating on how to provide for these negative emissions the next year. That is free riding. You wait for others doing the job of bringing the costs down of negative emissions, of scaling a new industry, of providing all that blue that you then also need in your target year. And the third is you can basically help others to reduce their emissions as well. And that has been so far a bit let's call it the old world of companies' actions when they help beyond their own value chain. And the SBT, the Science Based Target Initiative, displays that with this little butterfly chart, basically saying usually a forward-looking company comes from here. They compensate all emissions through so-called carbon avoidance certificates or insetting in their own value chain. And when they do that, they basically emit 1 ton and pay somebody else to reduce his or her ton. At the end of the day, your ton is still being emitted. And this is not compatible with net zero, right? If everybody starts doing this type of avoidance compensation, we just lock in the 40 gigatons of annual emissions we have today and prevent more emissions from coming on top of that. What you have to do instead is, if you as a company are still responsible for emissions, you have to pay somebody to remove that immediately. And then you can claim that you have net zero emissions. Now, translating that into what SwissRe is doing, we have been basically, these are absolute emissions. COVID has caused a dent. We are climate neutral since 2003. That was pretty early in the days. And with that, we basically prevent the same amount of emissions from going again in the atmosphere. That's what I display here with this dashed line, because we purchased these type of avoidance certificates in the past. And climate neutral was the claim corporates used the last 20 years. I know now people use it interchangeably with net zero or climate positive, or it's a big mess in terminology. But I can tell you the last 20 years, it was clear what climate neutral means, and that was you compensate residual emissions with avoidance credits. Now, going forward, we don't want to go back to the same level by setting stringent flight targets. We will continuously improve and bring emissions down. But it's not our target here to be in 2030 still with these emissions and do the same as we did here. We want to be net zero by 2030. That's our commitment. And that means we have to bring in these negative emissions over time to balance at the end the still positive emissions with the same amount of negative emissions. We also don't want to use or lose the climate neutrality claim. We want to be climate neutral in transition to net zero. Okay. And what that means essentially is we still keep buying offsets. We purchased high quality offsets at around $10 or $15 per ton. So that's already, projects with a lot of co-benefits. And we do that actually since 2003, as early as then. We highlighted the co-benefits piece. So we don't want to give that up. We don't want to unplug the carbon finance there, but give them 10 years time to find new financiers. Ideally, if in theory it works, under the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions. So we keep buying offsets, but we phase them out as we ramp up the purchase of carbon removal. This year, we have committed to 10% removals, high quality removals in the compensation mix. By 2025, it will be 50-50 split. And by 2030, it will be 100% high quality removals and no offsets anymore, in line with our net zero target. Very quickly, carbon removal, maybe it's new for some or not as much heard. You can use nature. Nature takes CO2 from the air, builds it in its biomass, which gives the storage form basically. Or you can use filter machines, directly take CO2 from the air. That takes a lot of energy. That has to be clean energy. Otherwise, the CO2 balance is not working. But then you have a pure CO2 stream, and you can bring that mostly underground or transform it into durable products. there are hybrid solutions that use a bit of both worlds. Now, the reason why it's interesting, or you need to understand the difference between nature-based and technological solutions, is when you do a projection on how much nature-based solutions in purple or technological solutions in gray you're going to have over the next 10 years or over the next 30 years, you see today we have basically nothing. Over the next 10 years, we get the nature-based solutions to scale, but then they flatten out. Okay, there isn't much scaling in terms of the annual removal potential, and beyond that, we will run out of that. We can't, add more nature to the equation because we will run out of land. Nature-based solutions need land, and at some point there is not enough of that. The technologicals, we have to kick them somehow to the potential they can develop over the next 10 years, but then they really overtake the nature-based solutions. And in the end, over the next, this full period of a lot of blue area you've seen in the first slide, that is mostly technological solutions. Now the cost, it's a bit different. The costs are now okay-ish with the nature-based solutions. Some say they are even at zero. I've not seen that, but let's say it's lower double-digit. Then costs become more expensive over time as we run out of land, and that will dictate how the cost curve goes up. So it cannot profit from technological learnings or whatever, which has to take place in the technological solutions that can now cost several hundreds of dollars. But as we deploy them, these costs ought to come down, but only if we deploy them. And that brings me to my last slide, which is the key message to kick off to Patrick. And this is basically to say, how can companies use removal smartly today? And it's essentially by working together and buying a balanced mix. Because not everybody, I would argue nobody, not SwissRe, nobody can afford these really expensive solutions, technological solutions, to compensate 100% of its footprint, of an unavoided footprint today. You will have to blend the bulk of the removal coming from the cheaper nature-based solutions or coming from high-quality avoidance certificates also. Okay, a little bit of your removals budget should be invested today so that these costs can come down and they take over in 2050 as the bulk of the removals need, where nature-based solutions became more expensive and scarcer, so they will not make the majority. Today, we can keep these costs in the blend down to below $100 by doing so. So here we pay more, obviously, but since we pay less here, it will be well below $100, which is something that we see in the market people are willing to put. And we prevent in the future to have prices much higher than $100, because if we don't do that now, these costs stay high, the technological solutions, and these costs, the nature-based solutions, they come up much more quickly. So in the end, we make it more expensive for the world to get to net zero. And this shouldn't be the purpose of our climate action today. All right, that's it. That's what I wanted to share. Of course, longer than 10 minutes. Apologies for that up front.
No problem. Misha, thanks so much. That was terrific. And I want to remind everybody, we have a few questions rolling in. Now's the time to put your questions into that chat box. You'll see a little tab that says questions. You click it, you type your question in, and we will get to those questions very shortly. In the meantime, I'd like to turn it over to Patrick and Rio.
So I'll walk you through this, the next generation carbon removal facility, which we're developing together with Mitsubishi Corporation. Before I get there, just maybe to complement a few things that Misha said before. So first of all, what do we mean by next generation carbon removals, and why do we need them? So as Misha highlighted, so going forward, we will need to reduce emissions wherever possible. But we will always have some residual emissions, and according to the more realistic IPCC scenarios, we'll need 10 to 20 gigatons of removals per year by 2050, which is quite staggering. If you put a price to these gigatons and you compare that to the size of the oil and gas industry today, the size of this carbon removal market would be equal or even bigger than the entire oil and gas industry today. So you can, in general, just picture how much infrastructure and investments we will need to get to that scale. As Misha pointed out, nature-based removals are great. South Pole is doing a lot in this space as well. They are in the short term the most attractive solution. They come at a lower cost with multiple co-benefits. However, if you think about reforestation or afforestation, these activities, they depend on very scarce resources like land and water. And science tells us that we won't have enough land to get to the removals, to the volumes we need in the long run. So what we mean by next generation carbon removals, these would be the things that go beyond the nature-based removals. They include things like direct air capture, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, enhanced weathering, biochar, CO2 mineralisation, for example. And they will be required in the long run to meet the Paris target. That's pretty clear, also based on what you heard from Misha before. So that's not just South Pole saying this. This is really based on IPCC scenarios and all the science that goes into the climate models and emissions modeling going forward. The problem with these next generation removals is that as of today, they are still underdeveloped and quite costly, ranging from $100 to $600 per ton. However, if we want to get to the scale that we need by 2050, we need to start investing in these technologies and in these next generation removals today. Because these technologies have to go through a technological learning curve, and only then will we be able to reduce the costs so much that we can scale them without basically incurring prohibitive costs for our economy. You can compare this to renewables. So 20 years ago, if you think of the cost of wind or solar energy, that was also prohibitively expensive. And only when we started deploying these renewable energy technologies at scale, we managed to bring down the costs. And now these technologies are more attractive than fossil fuel-based power generation, for example. And then it becomes, the machine run on its own, basically. So I think we need to achieve something similar, or basically the same thing with these technological removals. And that's exactly what we are trying to support with this next generation carbon removal purchase facility. So we want to help to upscale this sector by providing basically a price signal at the right price, and providing like revenue certainty for these projects at the price that they need today, so that they can start to scale. This slide is just to highlight again the difference between the nature-based removals, with the focus here on afforestation, reforestation, and the next generation carbon removals. As Misha highlighted, there are pros and cons to both. It's very clear, and I would always stress that we need both. So there is no point in arguing that one is better than the other. If we want to have a chance of reaching net zero, we need all these solutions being deployed in parallel. And I think if you look on the right side, on the next generation carbon removal facilities, I think the one big advantage that they have is around permanence. So if you think of forests and forest fires, for example, there is a big reversal risk, and there is always a risk that the CO2 that was captured and stored in a tree is basically goes back to the atmosphere. We wouldn't have that with most technological removals. So that's, I think, probably one of the biggest advantages. However, they require high upfront cost. And as I said before, the technologies are not very mature yet. Another barrier that South Pole is also addressing through the CCS Plus initiative, which was launched a couple of months back, is the lack of standards to certify these projects. So we're currently developing a whole range of methodologies together with Verra and the Verified Carbon Standard to address the barrier. And yeah, the price ranges, you saw this also in a presentation by Misha. You see, you know, the price ranges today and how we expect the prices to develop in the long run or at least by 2030. And you know, to maybe highlight the challenge that Misha presented in his presentation, another way to put this is basically by looking at these volumes that we need. So these are this 10 to 20 gigatons of removals. It's just like an illustrative slide. So we need to go from a very low volume today to a massive volume in the future. And in order to do that, we basically need to bring down the costs of these technologies from currently something between $300 a ton to $1,000 or more than $1,000 a ton for the more technological solutions. That needs to go down to a price level below $100 a ton in order to, yeah, basically make this whole thing economically feasible. And as I said before, our carbon removal purchase facility aims to do that. And how the facility works is shown in the slide. So you see the buyers on the left with their net zero commitments, the purchase facility in the middle, and the carbon removal projects to the right. So what we will do with the facility is first aggregate demand from buyers, and the buyers will sign binding offtake agreements with the facility. So they will commit to the purchase of carbon removals over 10 years or more. With the facility. We then do back-to-back contracts, also binding offtake agreements with the projects. That means that for every, you know, removed ton of CO2 that the project delivers, we would pay a fixed price at the price that the projects need in order to run for the next 10 years. And that basically makes the projects bankable. So you have revenue certainty for these projects at the price point that is typically higher than carbon markets today. So look at voluntary carbon markets or even compliance schemes today, they don't deliver the price signals or the kind of revenue certainty that these projects will need. So the facility needs to pay a price beyond that. And if we have these binding offtake agreements over 10 years, that basically enables then investors to come in and finance technology providers and the project developers to make the projects happen on the ground. So the facility does not provide upfront finance. It just like a long-term offtake agreement. You can compare that to a power purchase agreement in the electricity sector, where you just commit to a certain price for every kilowatt hour that is delivered to the grid or to a specific buyer. So it's the same logic here. And once, you know, the projects are up and running, they go through the carbon credit certification cycle. They issue credits, which we then the facility delivers to buyers, which buyers can then use to comply with their net zero commitments, as highlighted in the example of SwissRe by Misha. And then what we have is then payment by the buyers on delivery of the credits to the facility, and then the facility channels the money on to the project for every ton of CO2 that they removed. That's in a nutshell the concept of the facility. We have run such facilities, same concept in carbon markets before. I think the main innovation here is that we are targeting explicitly these next generation carbon removals. That's I think the main innovation. But other than that, the concept is well established and tested. So the value proposition of the facility is basically we aggregate demand for certified next generation carbon removals from a range of buyers. On the back of that demand, we create and curate the project pipeline based on project types like BECCS, direct air capture, mineralization. enhanced weathering and biochar. So that's, I think, the scope that we have identified so far. The facility then takes care of all the offtake agreements and financial transactions, like a one-stop shop from a perspective of the buyer. We are also in the process of developing partnerships with strategic partners, including investors, think tanks, and market regulators, to help bring, for example, project finance to the projects once they have this revenue certainty. Yeah, and on the right side, you know, from a buyer's perspective, if you think why should a buyer consider to purchase removals through this facility, it's really at the moment, I mean, especially now in this over the next 10 years, I think it's needed to achieve that last mile of your net zero commitments with the highest quality of certified carbon removals. As I said before, especially when it comes to permanence, there is nothing that can beat this kind of category of removals. We can reduce transaction costs by aggregating a large pool of projects. So a buyer doesn't have to go through the due diligence of projects on their own. They can really outsource that to the facility. And because we have basically purchase power, a much bigger purchase power than a single buyer, we can also negotiate better terms and make sure that buyers benefit also from declining prices in the future as these technologies go through the technological learning curve. Another important element is diversification. So by also having these technological carbon removals in your portfolio, you're not dependent only on nature-based solutions. And that's something that we're observing in the market. There is a big run for nature-based removals at the moment. The supply is simply not there. And then many buyers, I think, will run the risk of not having any supply at all, or dealing with very volatile prices or price spikes because there is simply a mismatch in demand between for the nature-based solutions at the moment. Yeah, so that's I think on the value proposition. And at this point in time, I hand over to my colleague Rio, who will talk a bit more about the project pipeline we have and the facility.
Thank you, Patrick. My name is Rio. I'm joining this call from Houston. Yes, actually, there are a number of opportunities for carbon removal. Actually, the biochar, the bags, direct air capture, enhanced weathering, the CO2 derived carbon are listed. I think 3 years ago, when I started project development in carbon management, there were no project at all. But the good news is we have so many project pipeline, project leads, and actually now many technology startup proposing the great solution of carbon removal. Actually, we really keen to aggregate such project in this facility. Can you go next, please? Let me explain the example of a technology, which is like the carbon mineralization. If you talk about CO2 mineralization, we think about the building materials industry, which is concrete. So Mitsubishi is leading the green concrete initiative. Some people say CCU, the carbon capture utilization. The reason why Mitsubishi identifies this technology is great because it's gigatonne-scale solution. Actually, our problem is gigatonne-scale, so we need to find out gigatonne-scale solution. Yeah, obviously, the concrete industry, ready-mix concrete industry, building material industry is so huge. So still, we have some challenges in logistics and cost, but actually, when we can scale this technology, probably this is going to be the gigaton-scale solution. I think this chart shows our partner companies, the CarbonCure. We have partnership with CarbonCure, and they are a global company, and we are in collaboration with Procure to deploy its technology in Japan and beyond. And CO2 Suicon, this is Japanese technology. We are very keen to introduce this technology to overseas market. And not only cement reduction, actually more, I need to talk about aggregate more, because in concrete, the most of a component is coming from aggregate, which is gravel, stone, gravels. So if you can sequence the CO2 into aggregates, it is kind of rock, stone. I think that the potential of CO2 sequestration in concrete blocks will be much enhanced. We have partnership with Blue Planet, which is California-based company. Now we are helping its commercial demonstration in San Francisco, and OCO, which is a UK-based company. They are already in commercial basis, and we are very keen to deploy its technology in Asia and beyond. Yeah, probably you have some question why Mitsubishi is there. Yeah, South Pole is a global leading carbon credit developer and advisor. Actually, why Mitsubishi? Because we are very keen to develop carbon removal project, and carbon. Mitsubishi Corporation is a project investor, and also we are very keen to scale the technology by leveraging this facility. Of course, we are very keen to purchase carbon removal credits as well. But right now, Mitsubishi's objective is we are really keen to help to propose more and more projects in this facility, and also to help the company who has the technology of carbon removal. And also we have the global footprint, and also our business portfolio is very, very versatile. And my background is oil and gas. We have building material team, we have mining team, we have machinery team, we have a retail team as well, and we have automotive as well, as you may know. So actually, to think about a CO2 sequestration, so cross-vertical partnership is very important. And not only having partnership with South Pole, I think Mitsubishi is quite keen to provide our business capability for this facility. Go next, please.
And I think I take over here to cover the South Pole part. So we announced the facility a couple of months back. So the idea is that we will co-manage the facility together with Mitsubishi Corporation. So South Pole, has its core business in carbon markets and project development. So we bring that expertise in, and I'm super excited about the partnership with Mitsubishi because there is a lot of complementarity in there in terms of geography, but also access to technologies, and also Mitsubishi's trading capabilities, and obviously the balance sheet of Mitsubishi, which is required, I think, to bring the facility to the level that we need, and to make sure that we really can do bankable contracts that will enable finance to flow to the projects, as I showed in the beginning of the presentation. So to conclude, and I'll run, I think, for the last slides a bit quicker. So from a buyer's perspective, right, how does the facility fit into a net zero plan, building also on what Misha said in the beginning? So if you agree as a company that you need to decarbonize, procure nature-based credits for the bulk of the short-term removals, but also support these next generation removals for the reasons I highlighted before, the facility offers a really attractive solution. And our advice to companies at the moment is not to spend their entire budget for removals on nature-based removals alone. They should start allocating a small part of their portfolio. It can be just in terms of volumes, could be anything between 2% to 10% of the removals volumes. It could be allocated to these, should be allocated to technological removals at this higher price today, but that will do a great deal in advancing the sector and bringing down the costs over time. Exactly, and then over time, the idea would be that, as shown in Misha's slide, that the portion of these next generation carbon removals would grow then in the portfolio. Yeah, and we feel, you know, this is from a risk mitigation perspective, and also from the perspective of just supporting this market that we will all need as humanity turns, you know, a more conventional net zero strategy that is based maybe only on nature-based removals into a very impactful one. And in terms of timeline, what we are doing now, we're developing the facility. We're pretty far in with the concept. We want to establish the facility towards the end of this year, beginning of next year. So there will be a dedicated legal entity for the facility, co-owned by South Pole and Mitsubishi. We will run a marketing campaign next year to onboard buyers. So we are thinking of up to 100 buyers that will be needed to get to the volumes that we need. Out of these 100 buyers, we will have between 5 and 10 anchor buyers that will commit about $1 million per year over 10 years. That will be the minimum ticket size for an anchor buyer. And we are in advanced discussions already with several anchor buyers, aiming for signing contracts until the end of the year. And then we will onboard additional buyers throughout 2022. On the project side, we have already a good pipeline of projects, and we will contract them once the facility is established and we have the commitments by the anchor buyers. And first issuance of credits from a couple of biochar projects is already planned for the end of 2022. And if, you know, there are, just in case there are any potential anchor buyers in the audience, we have a timeline for expression of interests and non-disclosure agreements, and finalization of terms and conditions. I think if anyone would be interested to hear more about the facility, now it's quite a crucial time because it's the anchor buyers that will define the final scope of the facility in terms of project types, the average price that we should go for, and other quality criteria. So I think between now and end of the year is a crucial point in time for buyers to engage. So that's, I think, the key message there. And for buyers interested to join, we can say today that we have 3 buyers that signaled already interest to join the facility of like a formal expression of interest. 1 logo that is missing here, but already confirmed, as well as Boston Consulting Group. And in addition to these 4 potential anchor buyers, we are in discussions with more than 20 other buyers. As I said before, aiming to secure up to 10 buyers by the end of the year. And if anyone is interested to know more about the facility, please just write an email to me. You see the email address here at the bottom. Yeah, and here I think I finish and hand over to Michael Avery, who is basically developing one of the flagship projects that is in the facility, the direct air capture plant in Texas. And Michael will tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Nick, just a quick sound check. Am I coming through okay?
You sound terrific. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, good. Thank you. So really glad to be here. And, you know, thank you to the previous presenters for showing some really interesting stuff. I think a lot of that relates very closely to our project. And so, you know, I'm here today to talk about direct air capture, you know, 1.5 and our project, which we expect, you know, before long to be the world's largest direct air capture plant. I don't have any slides today. I'm just going to sort of tell the story. And so that begins with Occidental, or Oxy, which is an energy company that has ambition to become a carbon management company. We've spoken about this publicly quite a bit, but why and how does a company do that? And so, we've obviously, our leadership has established, strong net zero goals, along with many others. Our, ambition here is to be net zero in our own operations at scope 1 and 2 by 2040, and scope 3 by 2050. And in addition to our own ambition, we also want to be able to leverage our expertise to provide solutions for others. And so what are those expertise? Well, we've got 40 years of experience in CO2 sequestration in the geosphere. We are one of the largest handlers of carbon dioxide in the world. We have got, a lot of carbon dioxide handling infrastructure already in place through our operations. We know how to move it, we know how to store it, we know how to measure it. And so, it's a sort of key advantage or expertise that Oxy has got. In addition to that, Oxy is a major infrastructure project developer. We have done major projects all around the world. And so, we've chosen to invest in areas where our climate ambition aligns closely with our core capabilities. And that leads us to one of our major investments, which is direct air capture and the formation of 1.5. 1.5 is our direct air capture development company. It's owned by Occidental. We have the license to use carbon engineering's technology in the US with sequestration. And we're currently in the FEED stage, which is the front-end engineering design phase of the world's first 1 million ton per year direct air capture plant. We anticipate that construction is going to start next year, and the plant would be online by 2025, early 2025. And maybe it's worth just explaining very briefly what direct air capture is and what sequestration is in the context of this discussion. I'm sure that many of the listeners are familiar with this, but I'll just go into it very briefly. And direct air capture is essentially, it's a technical process or a machine, if you will, that withdraws carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Sequestration, in our case here, is the storage of that CO2 in the geosphere, which is to say deep underground in rock formations, which provides a sort of highly durable method of capture. And that then results in, the removal of that unit of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so, it is a removal credit that gets generated out of this, which the previous presenters talked about very nicely, I think. And so, these CO2 removals are really important in the global solution for the net zero narrative, right? And it's especially important to be adding technologically driven solutions alongside nature-based solutions here. I think that it's clear we need all the solutions to work, not just some of them. But I think the shift is going to be toward these high quality removals, like the ones that Patrick described in the facility. Direct air capture is really efficient. So one of our plants does the removal work of something like 40 million trees. Or another way to think about it is that 10 gigatons of removals. To do that through afforestation or reforestation would require a surface area roughly 3 times the size of the United States. Whereas for that same amount, 10 gigatons, direct air capture would require an area roughly the size of a large city. And so it's really, really efficient. It's important, I think, maybe just to reiterate one more time here that direct air capture does not replace all the good work that's being done by nature-based solutions or any other technological solutions. It needs to happen in addition to it. Direct air capture is really scalable. You can scale this up in our case, in 1 million ton per year increments with a 1.5 CE direct air capture plant. And by doing this at this really large scale allows us to bring the cost of removal to come down over time as more and more of these plants get built. And that sort of plugs into the previous presentations. It begins at a certain price, and then the more of these plants you develop, the more cost effective it becomes. And so how do we scale this up? Well, you know, to get direct air capture off the ground, it essentially requires a business case. And so you need a good technology that works at scale. And so we've got a great engineer, a great partner in carbon engineering on that front. And then can you deploy that technology at scale? And so, you know, that's something that obviously we do very well, but we've got another great partner in Wally who's helping us with the FEED study on this. And then you need capital to develop these projects. And so, you know, we do have a lot of experience in the deployment of these high dollar projects that need to get stood up pretty early. But finally, you know, you need a commercial model that closes the loop around all of this. And by that, I mean, you know, you need a market for the product that this technology will produce. And so, you know, that comes back to the facility, Patrick and Rio's comments earlier on why it's important to be able to close the loop and continue to develop technology like this. Policy support, of course, is critically important at the outset on every one of these dimensions as well. And when you've got all this, you've got a really sort of meaningful solution that's free to grow rapidly and have a very high impact in the challenge that we've got in front of us. You know, another great thing about direct air capture is that it allows us to position ourselves to provide really impactful solutions in these very hardest to decarbonize sectors. And so by that, I mean, you know, the aviation, the maritime, the heavy transport sectors where, you know, they're critical for global economies, but the cost to replace the infrastructure is enormous. And, you know, I think there we're able to offer a variety of solutions that fit customers' needs because we understand that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And every one of these solutions, I think, that play an important role in different sectors and may play varying levels of significance at different times in the energy transition. So, you know, maybe to pick an example here, it would be to say, all right, let's say that we've captured a ton of CO2 from the air. There's several things that you can do with it from that point. You know, one would be low carbon intensity fuels, something like LCAF or lower carbon aviation fuel, where, you know, through the process of producing the feedstock, that barrel of oil, you know, more CO2 is geologically sequestered than the scope 1 through 3 of that barrel would ever emit. We understand that this is not an option for everyone necessarily, but in these sectors that the transition is not as easy as others, and because, you know, it may be because of immature technology or the cost to replace infrastructure, whatever those reasons are, you know, if the transition in these sectors requires you to use fuels for some time, you know, wouldn't you rather it be low carbon intensity fuel or even net zero fuel? You know, another thing that you could do, because, you know, that solution doesn't necessarily work for everyone, the carbon offset removal credit system is a really important piece here, and you can do that by sequestering CO2 in saline formations beneath the ground, not associated with you know, oil and gas production. And these generate these removal credits, which are an important piece of the you know, the offsetting capability of many corporations and entities around the world. So that's one more thing that you can do with it. And then, you know, when you look at maybe the final leg here, it's synthetic fuels that have got very low carbon intensity. And this is a process where, you know, you capture the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then through a fuel synthesis process, you're able to convert that CO2 into very low carbon intensity liquid fuel. And so, you know, these are some of the solution sets that you can really develop with direct air capture. It's a really important piece in this puzzle. We're really excited about our project. And I'll probably stop there, maybe just to give us a couple minutes to do Q&A if anyone has anything for the group.
Michael, terrific. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite the rest of our panelists to resurface on the video, and we'll spend a few minutes answering folks' questions. I realize we're coming up against the hour. If folks are okay staying a couple extra minutes, we'll get to as many of these questions as possible. Quite a number of you asked whether or not this would be recorded. Yes, it will. You'll receive a link to that recording a little later today. You're welcome to share that with colleagues and so on. If you do have additional questions, now is your chance to type those into the question box. And I have attempted to consolidate these questions a bit so that we get to as many as we can. And I'll just throw it right out there. Question number 1 on carbon removals. What is this is for everybody, whoever wants to jump in, what is the science-based research that underpins this initiative, and how are these removals independently verified, measured, and ultimately certified?
Shall I go first? Yeah, so I think that the scientific basis, I mean, it goes back to IPCC, and I think that the whole term of net zero and what net zero means is underpinned by the IPCC. Also, the most recent report by the International Energy Agency confirmed the need for these also the technological removals in addition to nature-based removals. So I think there's a lot of literature, and I would say that the need for these levels of removals also assuming that we will probably not be down the path of the most optimistic IPCC scenarios, but most likely in the overshoot scenarios. I think there is pretty much scientific consensus that we will need significant volumes of removals. And when it comes to the projects, there we, as I mentioned in my presentation, through an initiative called the CCS Plus initiative, we are developing now a whole range of methodologies under the verified carbon standard to certify the projects. This is the leading standard in voluntary carbon markets, so that it has about 80% of market share, and it follows very strict requirements around environmental integrity. So we always have to follow life cycle assessment thinking to assess the kind of energy consumption that is required by these projects, and make sure that we only account for the net amount of CO2 removed, subtracting any project emissions. And they will be all subject to third-party auditing and issuance by an independent standard-setting body. Yeah, I'll stop here. I don't know if others would like to chip in as well.
Patrick, I think you did a nice job there. Thank you. Nothing to add from my side.
Great. Another sort of consolidated question here. How do you all believe that these removals, this project in general, may ultimately change business behavior and therefore reduce the global growth in CO2 emissions in line with the objectives of Paris and the upcoming COP26?
Can I take this one? So, look, it is not about believing or not. This is about reading it in the books, what we have to do in terms of climate action today. And this is, we have to reduce, first of all, as much as we can, right? This is absolutely clear. The second then is we will have unavoided emissions, and as I highlighted, Earth's own emissions, and we have already put too much into the atmosphere at this point in 2021, that we have to take that out of the atmosphere again. So we have to work on both. And I would really argue that we should stop the discussion of one over the other, but we should basically, just help the solution. And our common journey is basically a safe climate. And that means, according to science, we should limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, and according to politics, preferably at 1.5 degrees. And that's the journey we are on with these initiatives, I think, and that's what was convincing for us. We know that, when we think of 70 years ahead, and I'm the father of 2 young kids, I do so, then we should think of, okay, what's needed, what ingredients are needed, and it needs everything. So it's really not the time to fight over one over the other solution. It's time to take action.
Good. Next question.
Nick, I have got I really apologize, but thank you so much for having me, and I hope that the questions do get answered by the rest of the group. They can stay on a bit longer.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank
you.
I'll
try to go for one more here, guys. This is a specific question on enhanced oil recovery. Does the facility plan to generate carbon removal certificates from enhanced oil recovery projects?
No, I can take that one. So enhanced, yeah, I think there are cases of enhanced oil recovery. If you think of EOR plus, where you could store more CO2 in the ground that comes out embedded in the oil. There are some cases that would qualify for removals, but only the delta, right? In terms of the additional amount of CO2 stored in the ground as opposed to the embedded carbon that comes out again. So in theory, that would be possible, but we made an explicit decision not to consider enhanced oil recovery in the facility. Reason being, we're talking mainly to buyers in the voluntary carbon market that are doing this voluntarily. And we know enhanced oil recovery is, yeah, it's a bit controversial. You know, there are many people that don't like it. So I think buyers, what we notice with buyers, there is a strong preference to stay clear from enhanced oil recovery at the moment. So that even though Occidental Petroleum and also 1.5, they are also capturing CO2 for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery. The project that we are including in our facility is only their project that has dedicated sequestration. So they will do both, but the project that we are contracting in the facility is only dedicated sequestration. So we're ruling out enhanced oil recovery.
And quickly to add from the buyer's perspective, it's really a no-go. We want to stay as far as possible away from using air captured CO2 to produce more oil, okay? Because the CC at the EOR plus thought is just not done yet, and there is no incentive to put more CO2 down there than absolutely necessary to produce that incremental oil. So I really want to stress that buyers, including ourselves, stay away from it, and it's not a good idea to produce more oil.
Well, folks, I think that we may wrap it at that. Unless anybody has any final comments, I want to thank you all for joining us. This was a terrific conversation. I mentioned before that this has been recorded, and everybody will receive a link to that recording shortly. If you do have additional questions or would like to reach out to South Pole or any of the panelists, you can certainly email me directly, n.aster, A-S-T-E-R, @southpole.com, or just reply to any of the emails that you've received about this event. We'll make sure that somebody gets back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much again. Please enjoy Climate Week, and we look forward to talking to you sometime soon.